A taxi driver stood up in the Tonight Show audience and told Robert De Niro, "You scared me in Taxi Driver because you knew things only real drivers know." What De Niro said next left everyone speechless. The Tonight Show studio was alive with its signature Tuesday evening energy in Manhattan. The familiar blue and gold lighting created that warm, electric atmosphere that had made the show a late-night institution for decades. Robert De Niro sat across from Jimmy Fallon, both engaged in what appeared to be a typical celebrity interview about his legendary career and enduring impact on cinema. The Roots had just finished their smooth musical transition, and the cameras were rolling hot. Jimmy's iconic curved desk gleamed under the professional studio lights, while the New York City skyline sparkled through the backdrop windows like a backdrop of cinematic dreams and urban stories. Robert looked every inch the acting legend he had become. At 80, he still possessed that intense, penetrating gaze and understated presence that had captivated audiences for over 5 decades, though now seasoned with the wisdom and gravitas that came from a lifetime of inhabiting complex characters. Dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit, with his silver hair neatly styled, he radiated the same magnetic authenticity that had made him one of cinema's most respected figures. "So, Bob," Jimmy said, his animated gestures punctuating every word, "you've given us some of the most unforgettable characters in film history. Travis Bickle, Jake LaMotta, Vito Corleone. How do you prepare for these incredibly complex roles? What's your process?" Robert's expression was characteristically thoughtful, measured. "Well, Jimmy, it depends on the character. Every role requires something different. You have to find what makes them real, what makes them human, even when they're doing things that are difficult to understand." The audience was clearly fascinated by his presence and insights, several older fans in the front rows leaning forward with obvious respect and admiration. "And speaking of making characters real," Jimmy continued, "let's talk about Taxi Driver. That performance as Travis Bickle is absolutely iconic. The loneliness, the rage, the descent into vigilantism, it felt so authentic, so lived in. How did you tap into that darkness?" Robert's demeanor became more reflective, more serious. Travis was a character who represented something that was happening in America at that time. The isolation, the alienation people were feeling in cities. Martin Scorsese and I wanted to make sure we captured that authentically. The conversation was flowing naturally, touching on his collaboration with Scorsese, his approach to method acting, and how Taxi Driver had become a cultural touchstone for exploring urban loneliness and social disconnection. The studio audience was completely engaged, hanging on every word from one of Hollywood's most enigmatic figures. "What's incredible about that performance," Jimmy said warmly, "is how real it feels. Travis doesn't feel like acting. He feels like someone you might actually encounter. That famous mirror scene, 'You talking to me?' That's become part of American culture." Robert nodded slightly, though there was something deeper in his eyes now, something that spoke of memories and experiences that went beyond typical acting preparation. "That scene came from a real place, Jimmy. When you're alone as much as Travis was, you start talking to yourself. You start creating conversations because there's no one else there." It was in this moment of reflection about isolation and character authenticity that a voice from the audience cut through the studio atmosphere with the raw honesty and working-class directness of someone who had lived the reality behind the performance. "Mr. De Niro?" Both Robert and Jimmy turned toward the sound. In the 5th row, center section, an older man in his 60s was standing among the seated audience members. He had graying hair, weathered hands, and wore a simple flannel shirt that suggested he was a working person, not a Hollywood insider. His posture and demeanor carried the dignity and straightforwardness of someone who had spent decades working honest jobs. "Yes," Robert responded immediately, his voice carrying a respect for working people that had always been part of his character. "What's your name?" "My name is Frank," the man replied, his voice steady and clear, carrying the accent of someone who had spent his life in New York City. "Frank Castellano. I've been driving a cab in this city for 40 years. "Frank the cab driver," Robert repeated with genuine interest. 40 years. That's a lifetime on these streets." Frank took a visible breath, and suddenly the energy in the studio shifted. The lighthearted conversation about acting techniques and career highlights was about to become something much more personal, much more profound. Mr. De Niro, Frank began, his voice gaining conviction with each word. I saw Taxi Driver when it came out in 1976. I was 26 years old, been driving for 6 years already. The studio fell silent. This wasn't just a fan sharing a memory. This was someone who had lived the reality that the film had portrayed. And I gotta tell you something, Frank continued, his voice carrying both respect and a kind of unsettled recognition. You scared me in that movie. Not because you were crazy, but because you knew things that only someone who really drove these streets would know. Robert sat completely still, clearly intrigued by what Frank was about to share. The way you held the steering wheel during those long night shifts, Frank said, his voice becoming more emotional. The way you looked at passengers in the rearview mirror. The way you talked about the garbage and the scum. That's exactly how it feels when you're out there, 3 a.m, picking up people nobody else wants to deal with. The weight of Frank's words settled over the studio like a revelation. Everyone present understood they were hearing from someone who had lived the experience that Robert had portrayed. But here's what really got to me, Frank continued, tears beginning to form in his eyes. The loneliness. The way Travis talked to himself. The way he watched people through that windshield like he was separated from the whole world. That's what it's really like, Mr. De Niro. That's what nobody talks about. Robert was leaning forward now, clearly moved by Frank's honesty and recognition. So, I have to ask you something I've been wondering about for 48 years, Frank said, his voice now carrying both hope and desperation for truth. Did you really drive a cab to prepare for that role? Because if you didn't, I don't know how you could have known all those things. The silence that followed was profound. This wasn't just about acting preparation. This was about the difference between performance and lived experience, between imagination and truth. Robert stared at Frank for a long moment, clearly understanding that this conversation was about to touch something deeply meaningful. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, quieter, more personal, stripped of all performer's distance. Frank, Robert said softly, I drove a cab for 3 months, 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. Without hesitation, without consulting producers or following any protocol, Robert De Niro stood up from his chair and walked directly into the audience toward Frank. What I'm about to tell you, Robert said as he reached Frank's row, I've never talked about in detail in all these years of interviews. Frank nodded, clearly understanding that he was about to hear something unprecedented from one of cinema's most private figures. I didn't just drive a cab for research, Frank, Robert began, his voice now carrying the weight of decades of hidden truth. I became a cab driver. I got a hack license. I worked the night shift in the worst parts of the city. The studio audience gasped audibly. This was clearly far beyond what anyone had expected to hear about method acting preparation. For 3 months, I wasn't Robert De Niro the actor, Robert continued, his voice growing more intense with each revelation. I was Bobby, a guy from the Bronx who drove nights because he couldn't sleep, who picked up prostitutes and junkies and people coming out of bars at 4 a.m. Jimmy had left his desk and was now standing at the edge of the stage, clearly recognizing that they were witnessing something historic. And you're right, Frank, Robert said, looking directly at him. The loneliness is real. Sitting in that car for 12 hours, watching the city through that windshield, listening to the radio chatter, it changes you. It isolates you from normal human connection. The emotion in his voice was palpable as decades of carefully guarded method acting secrets gave way to unexpected vulnerability. Those scenes where Travis talks to himself in the mirror, where he practices conversations, that wasn't scripted, Frank. That's what I was doing in my apartment after those shifts. I was losing track of who I was supposed to be. Robert reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, worn piece of laminated paper. This is my hack license from 1975, he said, showing it to Frank and the cameras. I kept it all these years because those 3 months taught me something about acting, about life, that I never learned in any class. He handed the license to Frank. I want you to have this because you understand what Travis was really going through. Not the violence, not the vigilante stuff, but the isolation, the feeling like you're watching life happen to other people while you're trapped behind that windshield. The studio was completely silent, except for the soft sounds of people being moved to tears by this unexpected revelation from one of cinema's most guarded figures. But here's what I learned during those months, Frank. Robert continued, his voice now filled with hard-earned wisdom. The city doesn't make you crazy. The loneliness does. When you spend that much time alone with your thoughts, when you see the worst parts of humanity every night, you start to think the whole world is broken. The audience began to applaud, but Robert held up his hand gently. Travis Bickle wasn't just a character I played, Frank. He was a warning about what happens when isolation and anger feed off each other. I had to go to that dark place to understand how someone could get so lost. Jimmy, his voice thick with emotion, addressed both Robert and Frank. This is incredible. Nearly 50 years later, we're finally hearing the real story behind one of the greatest performances in cinema history. But Robert wasn't finished. He began removing his charcoal gray jacket. "Frank," he said, draping the jacket over the man's shoulders, "this jacket has been with me through countless interviews where I've kept this truth private. Tonight, it goes home with someone who lived the reality I was trying to capture." Frank, now wearing Robert's expensive jacket, looked transformed, not by the garment, but by the recognition and validation he had received from his cinematic hero. "And Frank," Robert continued, "I want you to know that every cab driver who saw that movie and recognized something real in it, you were right. It wasn't just acting. It was me trying to honor the experience of people like you who do a job that most people never think about." He turned to address the cameras directly. "To anyone who feels invisible, who does work that goes unnoticed, who spends their nights watching the world from behind glass, your experience matters. Your isolation is real, and it deserves to be seen." The show ended differently that night. No standard closing monologue, no promotional segments. Just Robert and Jimmy sitting with Frank as the credits rolled, three men connected by the understanding that sometimes the greatest performances come not from imagination, but from the courage to live someone else's reality. When the episode aired 2 weeks later, it became the most watched Tonight Show segment featuring Robert De Niro in television history. The hashtag #JiwilasTaxiDriverTruth trended globally as millions of viewers shared their own stories of workplace isolation and the importance of recognizing overlooked professions. Frank became an unexpected advocate for cab drivers' rights and working-class representation in media. He always wore Robert's jacket to union meetings and interviews. Robert never spoke publicly about changing his approach to discussing his method acting techniques, but those close to him noticed something different. In subsequent interviews, he began acknowledging the personal costs of his immersive preparation more openly, admitting that some roles had required him to go places that were difficult to come back from. And every time someone mentioned the mirror scene from Taxi Driver after that night, Robert thought about Frank Castellano, and the moment he finally admitted that his greatest performance had come from temporarily losing himself in the loneliness and isolation of urban America. Sometimes, the most powerful art comes not from imagination, but from the willingness to live someone else's truth until it becomes your own.